Thank you for joining us at one of our 2022 Reed Fink Award and Southern Labor History Talk. This award honors Dr. Merle E. Reed and Dr. Gary Fink for their contributions to education, labor studies, and the Southern Labor Archives. Fellowships of at least $250 are awarded annually to individuals whose research in the Southern Labor Archives will lead to a book, article, dissertation, or other product. Our speaker today, Dr. Danielle Phillips Cunningham, is a program director and associate professor of multicultural women's and gender studies at Texas Women's University. She's a recipient of the National Women's Studies Association Sarah A. Whaley Book Prize for Outstanding Monograph on Women's Labor History. Her forthcoming Labor History, A Tower of Strength in the Labor World, Nanning Helen Burroughs International Training School for Women and Girls, is under contract with Georgetown University Press. Her book is supported by the African American Intellectual History Society CLR James Fellowship, American Philosophical Society Franklin Research Grant, and the TWU Creative Arts and Humanities Program. Her third project is a 20th century history of Black women's labor organizing in Atlanta, Georgia, that will feature Dorothy Bolden, who was the founder of the National Domestic Workers Union of America, and Elizabeth McDuffie, who was the co-founder of the first Black Federal Employees Union. The project is supported by research awards from the Atlanta University Center Robert Woodruff Library and Georgia State University Southern Labor Archives. As a fellow of the Op-Ed Project's Public Voices of the South, Dr. Phillips Cunningham has written op-eds about Southern African American women's labor organizing histories. Dr. Phillips Cunningham is a co-principal investigator of the Quakertown Stories, an African American public history and curriculum project funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities. She co-authored a two-part article with Quakertown descendants that was featured in the Washington Post in recognition of Juneteenth. Dr. Phillips Cunningham teaches undergraduate and graduate courses about women's labor and feminist womanist theories and research methods. She's currently co-teaching a course entitled Women Taking the Lead, Race, Gender, and Labor with Dr. Sherry Davis. Their course is cross-listed between Spelman College, Rutgers University, and the Advancing Black Strategists Initiative. Dr. Phillips Cunningham talk is titled We Aren't Aunt Jemima's Women, Constructing a History of Atlanta Domestic Workers Organizing. Please email your questions to archives@gsu.edu, and we will ask them at the end of the presentation. Danielle, welcome. We're so excited to have you here, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Lisa, and I am really happy to be here. And thanks so much for the wonderful introduction and for organizing this talk. I would also like to acknowledge the generous support from Georgia State University's Southern Labor Archives Reed Fink Award that has helped make my research in Atlanta possible. As someone who grew up in Atlanta, I am truly enjoying rediscovering the city's rich archival collections and now have an even deeper appreciation for them. So everyone, I am in the early stages of conducting archival research at the Southern Labor Archives and the Atlanta University Center's Robert Woodruff Library's archives and special collections. My aim is to write a 20th century history of Atlanta Black women's labor organizing and their influence on local, state, and national politics through the stories of local Black women's organizations, particularly club women's organizations, as well as through the stories of Elizabeth McDuffie and Dorothy Bolden. And I can explore this long history of Black women's organizing and class politics in Atlanta because of the foundational and groundbreaking scholarship produced by Atlanta-based scholars, such as Jacqueline Rouse, Vicki Crawford, and Maurice Hobson. So today I will discuss how I am placing archival holdings at the Southern Labor Archives and Robert Woodruff Library's archives into conversation with each other through my research about Bolden and McDuffie. Both organizers labored as domestic workers, lived in Atlanta for most of their lives, established historic labor organizations, and influenced politics on multiple fronts in ways that have benefited generations of people who came after them. I see my talk today as an invitation to engage in a discussion about my ongoing research rather than presenting a finished product. So I welcome ideas and insights that you'd like to share about local African American history during our discussion. And so I'd like to preface my talk by first explaining what grounds my approach to African Americans' labor history. As a Southerner and women's and gender studies scholar who does historical work, I am interested in asking what new knowledge emerges when we center Southern Black women's theories and organizing strategies. Although I graduated from Spelman College many moons ago, having been a comparative women's studies major at a historically Black women's institution continues to shape my thinking about everything. At Spelman, there was freedom to explore aspects of race, gender, class, and labor, and all of its complexities in a space that centers the writings, the lives, and resistance of Black women. While there, I developed a hunger for more information about Black women's labor activism. And I was inspired to research Black women's labor histories after learning more about the washerwomen's strike organized by Atlanta's Washing Society in 1881. Historian Tara Hunter was the first to discover the Washing Society's strike and archival records, and she wrote about the organization in her classic book, To Joy My Freedom: Southern Black Women's Lives and Labors After the Civil War. After slavery ended, most Black women had difficulty finding employment outside of domestic service and sharecropping due to racial and gender discrimination in the labor market. In 1881, 20 women who made a living cleaning the linens of white families in Atlanta organized Georgia's largest and most resilient labor strike. They were fed up with the low wages and long hours that made it impossible for them to meet their own basic needs and provide for their own families. As a result of their strike, some employers increased washerwomen's wages, and the Washing Society also stemmed the threat of commercial laundries encroaching on their clientele, and Black women controlled Atlanta's laundry trade for the next 29 years. So when I began conducting my own archival research about late 19th and early 20th century Black women's labor activism, I could not find evidence of their resistance in national labor union records. And this was puzzling to me at the time because Black women had been organizing strikes since emancipation, and the Washing Society had organized this impressive strike in Atlanta. So, why were Black women not present in labor union archives? Well, I later discovered that their absence from the archive was due to what I call Jane Crow unionism, or the exclusion of Black women and their labor interests from labor unions, which were primarily run by white immigrant and white American men. And I'm borrowing the term Jane Crow from feminist legal scholar Pauli Murray, who came up with this term to describe the particular impact of Jim Crow laws on Black women because of intersecting racial and gender inequities. During what I call the Jane Crow unionism era of the late 19th century and part of the 20th century, union leaders refused to address working conditions in domestic service and sharecropping, the two major employment sectors for Black women. And as a result, Black women created their own trade societies and their own labor organizations to assert their need for labor rights. So, my work has involved looking at Southern Black women's institutions and organizations to document the quote unquote hidden resistance and hidden histories of labor resistance, and to expand public conversations about pressing labor issues that continue to impact Black people's working lives. And so the overarching question that I examined in my book, Putting Their Hands on Race, Irish Immigrant and Southern Black Domestic Workers, was how did Southern Black women resist labor exploitation outside of labor unions? I was interested in documenting Southern Black women's influence on labor resistance in northern cities and their interactions with immigrant white women in the fight for labor rights and household employment. Southern Black women and Irish immigrant women were the two largest groups of women employed in domestic service in U.S. northeastern cities. And as Tara Hunter brings up in her book, a small percentage of Irish women in Atlanta actually joined the Washing Society in their strikes in Atlanta. So in northeastern cities, they had to organize outside of labor unions because no major labor organizations were willing to address working conditions in the privacy of employers' homes. Both groups of women, I argued, put their hands on race or worked at challenging racial and gender stereotypes to assert their right to living wages without union representation through labor organizing, building settlement homes for migrant women, writing letters that exposed exploitative employers, writing speeches, essays, and books about race and women's work, and going about the business of everyday work to provide for their families. While Irish immigrant and Southern Black women's specific goals were distinct and intersected, their outcomes could not have been more different. Irish women worked at prying open the boundaries of white female respectability to include themselves, while Southern Black women challenged the very premise of race that denied their humanity through labor resistance well into the 1970s. And so Irish women eventually transitioned out of domestic service as they became whiter, whereas Black women were barred from most areas of employment until after the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Yet, most working class Black women still labored in domestic service across the country. And their continuous struggle against labor exploitation is what brought me to Dorothy Bolden's story and her establishment of the National Domestic Workers Union of America. Her story reflects how Black women's long history of labor activism has become a model for labor unions and policymakers today who are grappling with how to address intersecting racial, class, and gender inequities in labor unions, institutions, and national legislation. And so, the central question that has informed my research at the Southern Labor Archives and that has connected my work since the publication of my book is how did Black women across social class integrate labor organizing into their larger movement of tackling the unfulfilled promises of US citizenship through their organizations and institutions? And this fundamental question keeps drawing me back to Atlanta, even when I am researching Southern Black women organizers in other cities. For example, my forthcoming labor history, entitled A Tower of Strength in the Labor World, is about educator and civil rights activist Nannie Helen Burroughs, and she was a close advisor to Martin Luther King Jr. In 1909, she established the first national school owned and managed by Black women outside of the Deep South to improve the working conditions of Black women and girls and create new avenues of employment for them. The name of her school was the National Training School for Women and Girls, and it was located in Washington, D.C. And Burroughs considered Spelman College a model for her school. She traveled to Atlanta often, and several faculty members from Spelman College visited her school during its 51-year existence. Atlanta University Center presidents and faculty members supported her school and joined her historic labor organization known as the National Association of Wage Earners. In 1921, Burroughs founded this organization, which was the first national Black women's organization that fought for labor rights for Black domestic workers. So, in many ways, it was a precursor to the National Domestic Workers Union of America. Most members of the NAWE were domestic workers, as well as people who might consider middle class women today and workers today, such as club women, teachers, and insurance agents. And as I am wrapping up the book, I am embarking on my next project, which is to write about the genealogy of Atlanta Black women's organizing. Shortly before the historic election of Senators Warnock and Ossoff, I wrote a Washington Post op ed predicting that they would win their races, partly because of the political organizing structures that Black women labor organizers had been building in Atlanta for well over a century. And an important part of that history, I believe, lies in the tradition of organizing from the 1881 Washing Society to Elizabeth McDuffie to Dorothy Bolden and Black women organizers during and in between their eras. So while researching Bolden's and McDuffie's stories, I am also interested in examining how Black women worked across social class boundaries to engage in labor and political organizing. One of the most striking photographs to me in the Southern Labor Archives is the photograph of Coretta Scott King and Dorothy Bolden, which is featured on the right side of this slide. Just this one photograph presents opportunities to explore Black women's organizing across social class and to reimagine Coretta Scott King as someone who was active in the Black women's labor movements. Constructing an intersectional history of Atlanta Black women's labor organizing has required working across and placing into conversation archival collections at the Southern Labor Archives and the Atlanta University Center's Robert Woodruff Libraries archives. The Southern Labor Archives holds most of Bolden's and the NDWUA's records, and the Elizabeth McDuffie collection is in the Woodruff Archives. And my publication plans include either writing a book or a series of op-eds and journal articles about Atlanta domestic workers' influence on city and national politics by centering the stories of McDuffie, Bolden, and Atlanta institutions and organizations. So, in many ways, Bolden built on the labor and political organizing of her predecessor, Elizabeth McDuffie. McDuffie was born in 1881 in Newton County, Georgia, on a sharecropping farm to formerly enslaved parents. She was the only child, and she moved with her parents to Atlanta when she was 6 years old. Her parents were part of the migration of formerly enslaved people who left small rural towns across the South for southern cities like Atlanta in search of educational opportunities for their children and employment outside of sharecropping. McDuffie's parents were able to do just that in Atlanta. Her mother worked as a cook in private homes, and her father worked in a lumber yard. McDuffie attended Summerhill Public Grammar School. She took high school courses at Morris Brown College and continued her college career there. After completing her junior year at Morris Brown, she withdrew from school because of health and financial reasons. McDuffie had dreams of becoming a registered nurse, but she could only find employment as a domestic worker because of limited job opportunities for Black women in the early 1900s. She was inspired to become a labor organizer after witnessing the 1906 Atlanta race riots. White mobs attacked Black people living in Atlanta after whites in the city circulated false rumors that a group of Black men had assaulted a group of white women. Of course, we know that this same myth was used to justify the terrorism and murder and destruction of self sustaining and prosperous Black businesses and communities during the Jim Crow era. The white mob in Atlanta pillaged Black businesses and homes along Decatur Street, Pryor Street, and Central Avenue, assaulting and murdering Black women, men, and children. The rioters also damaged Alonzo Herndon's barbershop, which is where Elizabeth McDuffie's husband worked. His name was Irvin McDuffie. and the mob murdered everyone who worked in a nearby barber shop. Elizabeth McDuffie made it her mission to advocate for laws to protect Black workers when she began working in President Franklin D. Roosevelt's White House. She worked in the White House from 1933 until 1945 as a maid, labor organizer, and personal assistant to the Roosevelt family. After her husband, Irvin McDuffie, was hired as a chauffeur for President Roosevelt. As Elizabeth McDuffie put it, quote, "Perhaps I remember that fearful march of my people from South Atlanta. My job at the White House became a little more than a job. It became a small crusade. Three chances I had for my crusade were in acting as an unofficial liaison between my race and the president, and helping to organize the United Government employees, and in campaigning among my own people for the election of Mr. Roosevelt." End quote. So McDuffie co-founded UGE, also known as the United Government Employees, with Edgar J. Brown. Brown was Irvin McDuffie's brother-in-law, and he teamed up with Elizabeth McDuffie to create the first union for Black federal government workers in the history of the U.S. UGE was a major voice for Black federal employees during a time when most major labor unions would not address racism in federal employment. As McDuffie explained, quote, "We did succeed in getting pay raises for government laundry workers. The UGE was no longer needed when the CIO and AFL organized government workers, but we did our part before the unions accepted colored members." End quote. Perhaps inspired by her own experiences as a domestic worker in Atlanta and in the White House, McDuffie insisted that UGE fight for an increase in wages for Black women who cleaned government officials' offices, and the organization was able to achieve that goal. The photograph on this slide was taken at the UGE's ninth anniversary celebration. Edgar Brown is standing next to President Roosevelt, and Elizabeth McDuffie is sitting on stage wearing a Black dress and a Black hat. Because of McDuffie's, Brown's, and UGE's persistent activism, President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 8802 in 1941 to prevent racial and ethnic discrimination in the federal government and the nation's defense industry. Although racism persisted, this was the first time in U.S. history that a president directly addressed racism in federal employment practices. And while McDuffie was interested in fighting for Black people on a national level, she never forgot about Black people in the South and people in her hometown of Atlanta. What I find most interesting and fascinating about her time in the White House was the important role that she played in Black labor organizing in both DC and in Atlanta. She skillfully and strategically organized across state lines by positioning herself as the liaison between Franklin Roosevelt, Eleanor Roosevelt, and civil rights leaders from Atlanta who were fighting to end racial and gender discrimination and the labor exploitation of Black workers. While working in the White House, McDuffie traveled frequently between DC and Atlanta, often, and worked closely with church, civil rights, and women's organizations in Atlanta to fight for local labor rights. And I'm finding that she did a lot of labor organizing at Liberty Street Baptist Church, which still exists in Atlanta today. So, similarly, I have been researching the ways in which Bolden infused her labor organizing into multiple organizations and committees in the city and nationally to trace her comprehensive organizing strategy for transforming not only working conditions in domestic service, but for changing all institutions that impacted the lives of Black women workers and their families. Bolden was born in Vine City, and she began working at the early age of 7 years old, washing diapers and babysitting for white families for $1.25 per week. By 12 years old, she was cleaning the home of a white family for $1.50 per week. Frustrated with the low pay and wanting to travel and experience new places, she left her job during the Great Migration to work in a commercial laundry in Illinois. It was there that she learned the power of labor unions. Initially, she made only $3 per week, but after the laundry workers unionized, she started making $23 a week. As she put it, quote, "We weren't making that much until our union came in. Then our wages went up and up. We got up to about $23. It made a great deal of difference," end quote. So after working at the laundry for 4 years, Bolden worked at Sears and Roebuck's in the mailroom. She made more there, earning up to $80 a week plus overtime, and she bought some stock in the company. She said that that was the first job that meant a great deal to her. She wanted to travel more, and she took on a variety of jobs in Alabama, New York City, and in other cities, working as a waitress, studying dressmaking, and working as a trucker. But she always came back to domestic service because she enjoyed teaching children. Bolden eventually settled permanently in Atlanta, where she raised her 6 children with her husband, Alfred, and labored as a domestic worker for 41 years. In 1968, Bolden decided to start organizing domestic workers after observing during her long bus rides to and from her job how employers fired maids easily and frequently. She said, quote, "One day I took 3 ladies and made a radio announcement and told how we were getting together in the National Domestic Workers Union of America. I picked up many members at the time, which was beautiful," end quote. The Civil Rights Division of the AFL-CIO tried to get the SEIU, also known as the Service Employees International Union, to integrate the NDWUA into their union, arguing that the organization could join SEIU members in janitorial and nursing home fields to fight for better working and service occupations overall. However, the SEIU did not move on that proposition. And similar to most labor unions from decades prior, they did not always think it was possible to organize private household workers. Nevertheless, the NDWUA accomplished a lot for an organization that was not a formally and federally recognized union. The NDWUA lasted from 1968 to 1996, which was quite impressive because many domestic worker organizations prior to the 1960s did not typically last that long. Over the years, Bolden and NDWUA members organized over 1,000 domestic workers across 10 cities. They pushed employers and local governments to enforce standardized wages for domestic workers at $13.50 per day for an 8-hour, 5 days a week job, $15 per day for one day, and deductions for Social Security and coverage for paid vacation days and paid sick leave. And I think that it is important to note not only Bolden's and the NDWUA's physical work of grassroots organizing, but also their intellectual work as labor organizers and strategists. They were politically savvy and strategic about how they presented themselves in their work. They redefined racist, classist, and sexist assumptions of what defined skilled labor. As Bolden argued, domestic workers had specialized knowledge and skills, which is why she referred to domestic workers as household technicians. In 1972, she convinced Jimmy Carter, when he was the governor of Georgia, to sign an executive order declaring Maids Honor Day to proclaim domestic workers as professional and indispensable workers. While Bolden did a lot of organizing within the NDWUA, she also organized against systemic inequalities across institutions and committees to improve the lives of Black women and their families. A common dream and aspiration for most Black domestic workers was to provide their children with a quality education so that they would not have to work in household employment. Although racial segregation in schools had ended in Atlanta by 1961, Black children still had unequal access to education in the city. In 1964, when Bolden's daughter was going to begin the eighth grade at Booker T. Washington High School, the district decided to bus all seventh and eighth graders to Central Junior High School, which was in a dilapidated building at the time. Bolden led the Parent Teacher Association in a 6-year protest against the Board of Education. The association demanded that the city build another middle school. As a result of their protests, the city built John F. Kennedy Middle School in Vine City. Bolden continued organizing through the PTA and eventually transformed the association into an influential bloc of voters in city elections, like she had done with the NDWUA. As she said, quote, "I was to them a rebel rouser. When I said something, we got it done. Anything that the voter starts, you are going to finish it. They don't get away with what they promised us," end quote. So Bolden was also the vice president of the Black Women's Coalition of Atlanta and worked for the state and national departments of labor. She was very much involved with voter organizing and was instrumental in the city electing officials whose agendas addressed Black women's labor interests. She developed a close working relationship with Maynard Jackson Jr. and convinced him to run as vice mayor. She told him, quote, "Maynard, stand up. You run for the vice mayor, and when you run, you're going to win it," end quote. And Jackson won. He also later credited Bolden and the NDWUA for playing a significant role in his election as the first Black mayor of Atlanta. Bolden was also a consistent supporter and critic of several other politicians who she helped elect to key city and state legislative offices, including Julian Bond, Andrew Young, and John Lewis. In fact, John Lewis once said that no one in Atlanta should think about running for office without gaining Bolden's support first. When Jimmy Carter was the governor of Georgia, Bolden met with him frequently about the working conditions of domestic workers. She also held Carter accountable for addressing problems in household employment when he was elected president of the US. She led the first delegation of household workers and members of the National Committee on Household Employment to Washington, D.C., to demand a meeting with him in the White House. They went there to insist that he enforce labor laws and make domestic service employers adhere to the minimum wage, unemployment insurance, workmen's compensation, and health insurance laws. As Bolden said, quote, "We've never been here to talk to any other president. This is a president who said who said he was elected by the plain people, and we can't be any plainer than household workers," end quote. So as I continue my research at the Southern Labor Archives, I would like to find more sources about Bolden's labor organizing and how she infused labor organizing into local clubs and institutions that are not necessarily associated with labor activism. During my research, I have come across the names of these organizations on the slide, and I'm wondering if any of you know anything about them. Bolden and McDuffie were active in some of these organizations, and some of these organizations preceded them. So I'm interested, for example, in looking at the Chautauqua Circle and the Neighborhood Union collections, which are at the Robert Woodruff Library. in terms of Black Club women's labor resistance, as well as the other organizations on the screen that have also come up in some of the collections at the Southern Labor Archives. So I know there are a lot of names of organizations on this slide, but I wanted to put all of them here in case someone attending today's talk will recognize some of them and want to offer insights about them. And so before going to the next slide, I will just pause for a brief minute here so that everyone can read the names of the organizations. Okay. So when we center the history of Black women labor organizers, we can re-envision and expand the resistance history of Atlanta, from one that primarily centers Martin Luther King Jr. and his male colleagues of the civil rights movement, to one that also includes Black women such as the Washington Society, Elizabeth McDuffie, Dorothy Bolden, and other Black women who had been building political infrastructures for labor and civil rights long before, during, and after the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. Expanding the narrative also presents possibilities for telling the histories of Atlanta's institutions differently. For example, and as Lisa mentioned at the beginning, I am co-teaching a course this semester with Cherie Davis, Senior Director of Women Innovating Labor Leadership at Rutgers University. And our course is entitled Women Taking the Lead, Race, Gender, and Labor. And it is a cross-listed course between Spelman College, Rutgers University, and the Advancing Black Strategists Initiative Fellowship Program. And the fellowship program is for labor organizers, some who are members of Atlanta's National Domestic Workers Alliance. And so one of our discussions just a few weeks ago in class was about how do we reimagine and retell Spelman College's founding, not only as an institution founded by two white women missionaries, but as an institution established the same year as the 1881 Atlanta Washerwomen's Strike. Contextualizing Spelman's history in this way opens several pathways for questions that would lead us to uncover more information about the first cohort of Spelman students and the Black women faculty who sustained and expanded the college to what it is today, and who engaged in their own acts of resistance through research and activism. So I'm also thinking about Selena Sloan Butler, who was a graduate of Spelman College and did some really groundbreaking research about the labor exploitation of Black women and girls in Georgia's prisons. So recontextualizing the history and really grounding it in the long history of Black women's labor activism in Atlanta presents these possibilities into looking more into Atlanta's institutions. Care in Action, who is on this slide, is the political arm of the National Domestic Workers Alliance and has been continuing the tradition of Black women's resistance charted by the Washington Society, McDuffie, and Bolden. Care in Action has been a force to be reckoned with in state political campaigns by registering and mobilizing several hundred first-time voters. And their influence on the most recent campaigns give us a lens into what is possible for everyone when we build on histories of Atlanta Black women's labor organizing. So thank you, and I look forward to discussing your questions.
As a reminder, please email questions to archives@gsu.edu. As we wait for questions to come in, I have a few for you. Can you talk more about the spaces where you're hoping to find more evidence of Black women's labor organizing?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, thank you for that question, Lisa. As I mentioned earlier, Black women often had to organize outside of labor unions because of racial and gender discrimination within labor unions, as well as most labor unions not wanting to address working conditions in people's private homes, particularly white families' private homes. And so I'm finding, and I've been finding this as I've been tracing Black women's labor organizing through my different research projects, is that um, they address labor issues even in spaces that aren't necessarily thought of as spaces where labor organizing happens. So I'll say, for example, churches. So while writing the book about boroughs, it led me to the Southern Baptist Convention's historical library and archives. And I never thought I'd have to go there. But it truly was a gem. You know, there were a lot of gems there, in which, you know, I found diaries and really personal writings in which she really talked about her labor strategies, her organizing strategies, but she was doing that through church women's organizations. She had transferred church women's organizations into fundraising and political, you know, structures to support her labor organization. And so Dorothy Bolden, given her connections to Ebenezer Baptist Church, um, Elizabeth McDuffie, who was an active member at Liberty Street Baptist Church. Bolden, I found in the Southern Labor Archives, also spoke at Liberty. So there are these cross sections between Black women labor organizers, and in these spaces that you wouldn't necessarily go to and say, oh, I'm going to find, you know, these women's strategies and meetings in these particular places, but they were there. And not and I also want to say, they didn't just use these places, for example, the churches, as meeting places, right? So the churches weren't just structures that held the meetings, right? But these women were also transforming the institutions and building committees within churches and other institutions to address their labor needs, right? So I'm really fascinated by that, and with Bolden, you know, she was, I mean, she has, I mean, Pramila Natterson's book, a lot of, you know, scholars have acknowledged definitely her influential organizing. And so I am also interested in how she was also transforming other institutions as she was organizing for the rights of domestic workers. And she had her hands and influence everywhere. I don't know when she got any sleep. I don't know when many of them got any sleep. With McDuffie, same thing. I mean, traveling back and forth between DC and Atlanta. And so some of their activist years, the active years, overlap. I'm thinking about McDuffie and Bolden. Um, and so, yeah, it would be interesting to see if their paths ever crossed in some of these spaces. So, yeah. And one more thing, there was the Neighborhood Union Collection, which I mentioned earlier. So I'm also interested in thinking about how women of the early 20th century in Atlanta, I'm thinking about Eugenia Hope, right? And Jacqueline Rouse's work, right? And how club women were also addressing Black women's labor right after Reconstruction. So there's a long, rich history in Atlanta, and I think they're in these spaces.
Yeah, I always find that intersection to be just a really interesting place to be because, yeah, when people think of the Southern Labor Archives, we think, you know, it's very siloed only about labor unions, but labor affects all aspects of your life. And so it's going to show up in these spaces.
Exactly. Exactly. And that reminds me, when I was there at the Southern Labor Archives this summer, wanted to look at the files there about Black cooperatives that were being formed in Georgia and in Atlanta at the time. And so I see that as also a space where Black women's organizing took place, right? I mean, developing, your own source of food and employment through these cooperatives was something that was happening in Atlanta. And also helping on Spelman College's campus. So there's this very expansive, history that Bowdoin built on, right? And was sitting inside of. And so I'm really interested in capturing the both and of her work too.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. And so, can you share some of your thoughts about the importance of Black women organizing history in the context of today's statewide election?
Yes, so that's definitely everywhere, right? And I think it's so important, and that's part of what drives my enthusiasm for this work, because I think it's the tradition of grassroots organizing, of strategizing as well, the intellectual work of Black women labor organizers, which is why Georgia made history. So I'm thinking about the special election in which Warnock and Ossoff were elected. As I mentioned, NDWA, the National Domestic Workers Alliance, there were several groups involved who helped make that possible. But the NDWA was a very influential, force in that. And so I think that as the country is watching all of these midterm elections and midterm races across the country, many eyes are looking at Georgia. And I think that um, Georgia is an important place to look at where change can possibly happen. And I think a lot of that is connected to this history as a result of Black women's organizing. I also think, and I'm thinking about something you mentioned, Lisa, about how labor is connected to everything. And so Black women really emphasized that in their labor organizing from the late 19th century on down to now. They were really enforcing that and saying, hey, it's about, the local and particular working conditions in the workplace, but it's connected to so much else. Right. And so I think that their comprehensive approach to labor organizing is so important as we think about politics today. I was just looking at an interview with Stacey Abrams on MSNBC, and she corrected one of the people who were on the news show, and they asked her the question, basically asked her, well, when are you going to stop focusing on Roe v. Wade? Because really, Americans are concerned about economic issues. And she said, but Roe v. Wade is an economic issue, right? A woman's right to choose is very much connected to the economy and their financial concerns, and also related to worker issues, right? So it's all connected. And I think that their history, I would like to think, and talking more about it, will also encourage people who don't see the connections to vote right differently. I'll just put out there personally, I don't think the poll should show the races as being as close as they are. I don't think, the races shouldn't be that close. Right. So I think that these histories remind us of the persistent issues, and hopefully lead us to make better decisions.
Yeah, I think it's a common mistake to think that history has no impact on modern events, but we
Mhm.
keep seeing these same cycles happening over and over again. And so it's so useful to be able to go back and look at these historical records to see what happened then
Yeah.
and look at those parallels today.
Yes, absolutely, because they're still happening.
So we have a question from Meg, and she asks, are there other examples in which Black women strategizing and organizing redefine common labor terms to be more inclusive or to center marginalized work? Especially since they have to get people in power who were not them to meet them where they were. They have to wrangle an exclusionary vocabulary.
Huh, that's interesting. Can you repeat the last part of that question again, please?
Sure. Especially since they have to get people in power who are not them to meet them where they were. They have to wrangle an exclusionary vocabulary.
Ah, interesting. So she's asking, uh, how did they redefine terms? What are
Mm-hmm.
other examples of how they redefine terms? That's interesting. Hmm.
Or like co-opting terms to kind of fit their needs.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know. I would have to think about that a little bit more. Um, but I can't talk but I can say overall in terms of Black women organizers' approach, I think their approaches have been effective because they meet people where they are. And they meet the reality and the materiality of people's lives. And so, because Black women workers are so important to Black communities overall, right? They always organize with this understanding that if you address Black women's working needs, then you're also addressing the needs of their communities, right? So, even if I'm thinking back to like the earlier parts of the 20th century, um, I don't. The other thing is people didn't really use jargon either, and that's also what made their movements accessible. So I have to think more about particular terms, but I can say overall their approach was expansive to make it inclusive as possible.
Yeah. Uh, so I want to remind people they can email us questions at archives@gsu.edu. In the meantime, I wanted to talk a little bit about kind of your work in the archive. So what did you find of interest here in the Southern Labor Archive? And did you find anything surprising or unexpected?
Yeah, I'm still researching the sources. What I found most interesting, so of course, looking at all of the sources directly related to the NDWUA, as well as sources, as I mentioned, the records about the cooperatives, the woman's era, looking at Black women's periodicals in Atlanta during the later half of the 20th century. And so, what that has done is encouraged me to really think about, again, this very extensive organizing that was happening around Bolden, with the organizing that she was involved in, and the organizing that continued after her. So that has been really interesting. I also enjoyed listening to an interview with Bolden, in which she was very open in talking about, and I think this interview happened towards the later part of her life, in which she was reflecting on the organizing. And I thought that was a really raw and honest look, right, at where class politics and labor politics were in Atlanta at the time. She expressed some of her disappointment with the class politics and politicians sometimes prioritizing the wants of the Black middle class in Atlanta, and so not always having poor people's interests at heart. So there was a distrust there. And so I found that really interesting, because, yeah, I found that interesting. And also, um, she's known as being an advisor to Martin Luther King Jr. and working closely with him. And I enjoyed reading her feminist perspectives, in which she said, the interviewer said, so what about Martin Luther King Jr.? Wanted to know more about him. And she said, well, he had help. He had a lot of help. He was wonderful and everything, but I really had his back, you know, and I really did support a lot of what and the NDWUA did as well. So that was one of the sources that really stood out to me, um, because we can read what people have done, but I also find it interesting and fascinating to read the thoughts of people who are reflecting on their careers and their lives, in terms of organizing. So, what has been done, what needs to be done, and what are some of the disappointments, and how can we address those disappointments or the things that didn't work out?
Yeah, I think they did that oral history in the 90s. And
Yeah.
she did not hold back.
No, she
Um,
did not. I was laughing at the station with my earphones. And I just said, oh my goodness, this is. She was not holding back, but I appreciated it,
mhm,
because I think sometimes it's tempting to focus on um, a really extraordinary organizer like Bolden in the beginning of their career, when they're really kind of optimistic and and active and energetic. And I also think it's really interesting to focus on the later years when they're looking back and saying,
mhm.
um, yeah, yeah. So that was just as instructive and revealing as some of her earlier interviews.
Yeah, and I love kind of a life history, oral history interview, because it's so impactful and powerful to hear someone speak about their experiences and their thoughts in their own words.
Yeah,
Um, and
yeah,
I think, yeah, having it be later allows her time to really reflect and be honest about that. And I love that she didn't hold back, and talked about what was both successful and was unsuccessful, the disappointments. I think
yeah.
we sometimes can get so wrapped up in our successes and trying to
Mhm,
ignore and minimize the failures when there's so much to learn
mhm.
from what went wrong.
I agree. I agree. And it's especially challenging to do that with extraordinary leaders like Bolden, who really, accomplished almost the impossible, right? So it's more tempting to just solely focus on what was accomplished than, yeah,
Yeah.
the learning moments that come from what didn't work as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask kind of what's next for this project? What should we be on the lookout for?
Yeah, I am. So I'm wrapping up the book about Nanny Helen Burroughs, and again, that keeps pulling me back to Atlanta because I'm finding, oh goodness, I tell you, first of all, following the lives of organizers is no small feat. Let me tell you, because they
Yeah.
were traveling, they were everywhere, and so that's why I'm interested in writing not only a local history of Atlanta Black women's organizing, but the influences of their organizing in other parts of the country, because they just traveled a lot. Bolden traveled a lot. So anyway, I'm finding that Burroughs did a lot of organizing at Liberty Street Baptist Church. So I'm hoping to get my hands on their archives. Um, and so after that, figuring out if I will write a book or a series of articles about this long, rich history of Atlanta Black women's organizing. So either be a book or a series of articles, but connecting everyone's activism from the late 19th century until right after Bolden.
Yeah, well, I'm really looking forward to reading them because I think it's going to be so interesting and impactful in the field to have all of that kind of tied together.
Mhm.
I think we can sometimes get so focused on just the one person that it happened in a broader setting.
Yep. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Well, thank you. Yeah, yeah. And again, I think I'm really drawn to this because having grown up in Atlanta, I know that it is not a perfect place. There's still class politics, class inequalities, and all of that. Um, but it is a special place in some ways, right? I'm in Texas right now, which is a majority minority state, and the races are not that close here. So having so it really is a unique history in Atlanta, and the activism that came out of it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we look forward to having you back at the Southern Labor Archives. And thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today and in such an insightful and thought provoking talk.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And
Of
thanks
course.
everyone for attending.
As we wrap up, I just wanted to give a plug for our Read Fink Award. Applications for the next year are open, and you can apply via our website. And if you have any questions, please email archives@gsu.edu. All right, thank you for attending.